Now that we understand how life evolved, how living organisms evolved into the hundreds of thousands of different species, what we will do in this section and the next two sections is look at the overall biodiversity of life itself. We will look at viruses, which fall into a little separate category, bacteria, archaea, protista. We're going to look at plants, fungi, animals, and we're going to understand how these organisms evolved through the eons of time. Now, first of all, we do recognize that all living organisms, while diverse, have the same basic genetic code. Therefore, of course, it points to a common ancestry. So as we look at the phylogenetic tree of life, we see that the phylogenetic tree is broken down into three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, and these domains are further broken down into six major kingdoms: bacteria, archaea, protista, fungi, plant, and animal. You notice I have viruses in a special category, and we will get to that in a moment. But if you look at this phylogenetic tree, you can clearly see that bacteria came first, followed by protista, which branched off into archaea, and then, as we can see, plants came next, fungi, animals, and the protist continued to evolve into a separate kingdom. Now, viruses. Viruses, if I ask you, are viruses alive? Most of you will tell me that they are alive. The reality is viruses are not alive. Viruses fall into the special group of entities that somehow straddle between life and non-life. First of all, viruses will vary in size and shape. Viruses basically are organized into protein and nucleic acid. Sometimes they have an envelope that surrounds them. Viruses cannot exist on their own. They have to find a host, a living organism. Viruses will infect all living organisms from bacteria to man. Viruses can only replicate in a living cell. The way a virus works is a virus will come into a cell, take over the machinery, and basically control the production of viral proteins, nucleic acids, and form a new virion. So the bottom line is, the reason why viruses are not living organisms is that they do not have all of the characteristics of life. They basically have two major characteristics. One, they have organization, and two, they have nucleic acid. But they do not have characteristics like energy metabolism, they do not have characteristics of reproduction, and so on. Now, viruses are very small. If we look at this slide, you can see the size, vast size of a eukaryotic cell, a protist. We can see that the bacteria is about 1/10 the size. But now when you look to the right and we'll look at a T4 virus, it is extremely small. Viruses are much smaller. We can put, for example, 20,000 viruses within a eukaryotic cell. Now here we're looking at a bacterial virus called a phage. If we look at this interesting virion, we see that it is quite complex in structure. It looks a little bit like a small landing module that we used for invading the moon. But simplistically, it is made up of protein and nucleic acid. Now, so how do viruses replicate? While every virus will have its own strategy for grabbing a cell and getting into it, we can summarize this in the following way. First of all, a virus will find a host cell that it can attach to. Once it does so, it will insert nucleic acid into the cell. The nucleic acid will actually produce proteins which will start and take over the machinery of the cell itself. A latency period may follow, but after this period, the viral proteins are synthesized, nucleic acid is made, and once the specific viral protein and nucleic acid is made, a self-assembly process takes place to form the complete infectious virion. The virus can then be released from the cell, or it may actually stay within a cell and be in a latent form, and in some cases it can actually transform a cell to a malignant state, or basically form a cancerous cell. An interesting virus, and a very important virus, is the HIV. Now, if we look at this virion, we see that within the center it has several nucleic acids, in this case RNA. It is surrounded by a protein capsid and an envelope with specific receptors. These receptors, of course, are designed to attach specifically to a host cell. Now, let's look at how an HIV virus attacks a cell, how it takes over the machinery and produces new virions. This virus, as you can imagine, has been studied extensively in view of its importance in health. To start with, the virus will attach itself to receptors on a given cell. Once the virus has attached itself, it will release its nucleic acid, which is RNA. In this case, the RNA has a small protein within it called reverse transcriptase. This protein is an enzyme that can take the RNA and convert it to a DNA molecule. So the RNA makes viral DNA. Now the viral DNA will continue to migrate towards the nuclei, and the viral DNA becomes integrated into the host DNA. Once the host DNA has the viral Trojan horse, so to speak, integrated within its own being, the viral DNA can then make specific viral RNA, viral proteins. As you can see, eventually all of this self-assembles and a virion is released to your right. Now, here's the important part of an HIV infection. The important part is that the nucleic acid of the virus becomes part of the host. Because the nucleic acid becomes part of the host, it is virtually, in fact, it is impossible to get rid of the virus, because to get rid of the virus, you have to get rid of the host itself. So this becomes a major challenge to healthcare, a major challenge to a virologist with respect to trying to cure HIV. In reality, we cannot cure HIV because the virus is integrated within the cell itself. So if we look at virus pathology overall, we have lots of different kinds of viruses. Each have their own strategy for infecting cells. We have acute illnesses like influenza virus. We have chronic illnesses like hepatitis, which infects the liver and can actually lead to cancer itself. We have situations where a virus comes in, causes a disease, and leads to a carrier state like hepatitis A. And we have, of course, the ubiquitous common herpes viruses, which comes in various forms and it has a different strategy for infection. But the overall strategy for the herpes virus is it can go into a cell, infect, and go into a latent form. And at a given time, the latent virus can reactivate itself and release new viruses. And finally, we have cancer-producing viruses like papillomavirus, which cause cervical cancer, and many other viruses that are associated with both animal and human cancer. So now we go to bacteria. Bacteria, of course, fall into a major kingdom within living organisms. Bacteria have all the characteristics of life, unlike viruses. Bacteria are prokaryotic cells. They came first. We have beneficial and pathogenic bacteria. Normal flora exists in all animals. In virtually every cavity, every part of an organism, you're going to find a resident microflora. Bacteria will come in various sizes and shapes. And bacteria, unlike viruses, can reproduce outside a living environment. Just a quick overview, we're looking at bacteria cocci, basically staphylococci, under an electron microscope. You can see the round shape and projections that come out of these bacteria that kind of basically holds them together. A rod-shaped bacteria, very common in gastrointestinal infections. And now we're looking at a spirilla, which is basically the type of bacteria that causes syphilis and other types of diseases. So if we look at the normal resident microflora, we can find specific microbes that exist in harmony with the human organism. We can find different species in the mouth, in the nasal cavity, or as we move into the gastrointestinal tract. Within the stomach, there are very, very few viruses because of the high acid conditions, but we do have specific microbes that somehow find their niche there and actually cause ulcers. As we move into the small and large intestine, we find multitudes of microbes there. I should say many of them playing a very important role in maintaining the normal microflora and therefore preventing pathogenic microbes from taking their place. The bottom line, when it comes to the resident microflora, they are there living in harmony and contribute greatly to the normal process of life. The only problem we have is when these resident microflora manage to penetrate into sterile environment outside of the oral cavities, the various cavities, into the sterile tissue environment. Here we're looking at cilia in the nasal cavity. You can see round cocci bacteria captured by the mucus in the lining of the nasal cavity. And of course, this is very beneficial as the mucus coagulates, basically traps the microbes, and every time we sneeze and we cough and so on, this material is released. So when you cough, that's a good sign, because what you're trying to do, of course, is get rid of invading microbes. Now we'll look at another type of, quote, bacteria called archaea. Archaea exist in extreme conditions. We put them in a separate kingdom because of their biochemical characteristics. But they look very much like bacteria. They probably evolved from bacteria, and they exist predominantly in extreme conditions. We refer to them as thermophils, those microbes that exist in a very, very hot environment. Halophils, microbes that exist in salty environments. And acidophils, microbes that exist in very, very acid environments. If we look, for example, in Yellowstone Park, where we have hot pools of water, we can find thermophils. Now we will look at another kingdom called the protista. Now the protista actually are the beginning of the animal-like characteristics. Protista will vary in structure from single cells to multicellular organisms. As you can see from this illustration, we're looking at plant-like protista, which basically are algae. These are photosynthetic. We're looking at a variety of different forms and shapes, and as you can see, this very, very large multicellular brown algae. Now remember, all of these are eukaryotic cells, which means they have a very, very complex internal structure, unlike prokaryotic cells. Now we're looking at animal-like protists, from the simple amoeba, parameciums, and parasites like Giardia that we're looking at right now. All these organisms have animal-like characteristics in that they respond to the environment. They are eukaryotic cells. They move. They have other features that you might relate to an animal-like structure. And finally, we have fungi-like protists. These microbes will become parasitic. We're looking at slime mold. And to the right, we're looking at a very interesting multicellular organism. This organism, called the slug, as you're looking at, is nothing but a compact mass of cells that somehow act as one, but it is not a true multicellular organism with organs and structures, but it's basically a mass of cells that somehow is able to communicate and respond to the environment as if it was, quote, an animal.